Now, welcome to another edition of News from Naboo with Thor's Lightning Takes. And let's get right to the news.
All right. So close to the Mandalorian. So close.
Days away.
Right. But we're going to talk about an interview that Jon Favreau did with Total Film Magazine. He's also been out doing the press rounds. Just now he's been in London, I believe, working on his Mando talk, I guess. He took a picture in front of a London mural that was even inspired by the Mandalorian. Pretty impressive. But in the conversation with Total Film, he talked kind of about some of the thought processes behind Season 3, the plans for the future, spin-off stuff. So we're going to talk about all that too. To start with, we know that Grogu and Mando are back together after spending a brief time apart. At least what feels like a brief time apart.
Wait, they were apart? If you just watched The Mandalorian, were they ever really apart?
No. But Grogu was off training with Luke Skywalker, and one of the theories that was floating around is that Grogu is eventually going to bridge the gap between Mandalorians and Jedi, who have been at odds with each other for a long time.
Bring peace to thousands of years of conflict.
Well, he is cute.
Grogu can do it all.
Favreau had this to say about Grogu's place in the relationship between those two cultures. He said, "You have a character, you have two different cultures that a lot of how the Mandalorian armor was described to me, as I talked to people at Lucasfilm and Dave Filoni, is that one of the theories is that technology was developed in order to combat the abilities of the Jedi. That they don't have these natural abilities, but to fight in these asymmetric battles, and you have to make up for your deficiencies. The armor was the thing that made up for those deficiencies against Force users. And yes, they were at war, but they did cooperate from time to time, as we've seen. And there were also characters like Tar Vizsla that was both. Grogu seems to have the potential to have a lot of significance in bridging these two cultures, and maybe he's a character that can walk both these worlds. We'll find out."
Is Grogu ever going to be like a real Mandalorian?
I don't know. How am I supposed to know that?
But I mean, can you actually see him being like Mandalorian? Acting and behaving like a Mandalorian, truly being Mandalorian? I mean, I'm not saying I can't. I'm wondering, it's more to people out there and for the comments. Like, do you actually see him?
It's really hard to see something cute as donning the helmet and turning into what we think are Mandalorians, or the badass Mandalorian.
Well, it's not even just bad. You know, badass does usually go at Mandalorian, but just the whole following the way and all these things and wearing the armor. You know, I'm assuming he won't have to do the helmet thing. I keep joking about that, but I mean, I don't know. Do people actually like see him and want him to be full-on Mandalorian?
Maybe in some respects. I don't know. It's really hard to say because you're so used to the aesthetic of what he is now that we're also used to him being more of a Jedi than a Mandalorian.
I mean, and if you're Disney and Lucasfilm, are you afraid of him losing his cuteness and being a serious character? You know, wearing the armor or being a Jedi and kind of becoming a Yoda character, whatever he does, or if he becomes both. I mean, how long is he going to stay, quote-unquote, Baby Yoda? And how long is it before he starts to, you know, become teenage Groot kind of character, right? Where he's growing to some degree, he's talking more, doing more things. I don't know. I think it's really going to be fascinating to see what they do with this character, because you know he's going to be a part of this franchise indefinitely.
There's
no way he's going to be sidelined anytime soon, if ever.
Well, the third season, as we know, will finally bring the planet of Mandalore back into live action. Or really into live action. Favreau was asked how much he was involved with kind of building Mandalore.
Brick by brick, I did it.
He said Dave and his team from the Clone Wars did a lot of heavy lifting when it came to the development of Mandalore. I found it very compelling that this planet was very desolate, not because that's the ecosystem that had existed historically, but because there had been so many wars and civil wars and conflicts between the tribes. And you have this warrior culture that couldn't stop fighting amongst themselves. And so the planet was turned into a wasteland long before the Purge and the Empire. And of course, when you're fighting amongst yourselves, it makes it that much more difficult to face an outside threat. And so it's sort of a tragic history that this planet has, but also a romantic vision of what once was. We inherited the designs from Dave and his team, and we wanted to show what happened. And we make some allusions to the Purge of Mandalore in the Book of Boba Fett. We show a montage of destruction. And now when we return to the planet, we get to see in the stark sunlight what the aftermath of all that destruction was.
Cool. Yeah. I mean, the Night of a Thousand Tears, which we see in Book of Boba Fett, was pretty cool. Well, I mean, not cool in terms of what's happening to him, but
we
cool
know
visually.
That Mandalore was in bad shape before the Empire got to it. They're already living in bubble cities.
Yeah, dome cities, but yeah, bubbles, domes, whatever you want to call them. Yeah, they had already messed up their planet
by infighting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then they brought up a question about having like the jaw-dropping moments like the previous 2 seasons did. I mean, over the past few months, every time Jon Favreau has replied that all he wants for the show is to kind of be a water cooler conversation. People get excited about it, speculating on what could happen in the next episode. He was asked if the season will break the internet again.
Well, he's not going to say no, is he?
He said, I hope
we got nothing. We got nothing cool happening this season. It's going to be boring.
He says, I hope that's the goal. The goal is, I don't know about breaking the internet. The goal is that we have enough things happen each episode that everybody wants to jump around the digital kitchen table and talk about it, and argue about it, and guess what's going to happen next. So I think the fun part of it is that it's a big conversation and people are excited. And that's part of what you get to do in a television that you don't get to do in the movies. With movies, you build up to it. Everyone sees it, everyone talks about it, and then they wait. And maybe another one is released a few years later. Here, every week, another one's hitting. I like that we're on Disney Plus, where it's each week is another episode. It's not all dropped at once, so it allows for a back and forth. I love to see if we guessed right. I love to see which ones the people react to better. And ultimately, we get the report card if we're doing our job well.
I do. I prefer the whole week to week. Even though, as I've said before, I'd love to sit down and watch the entire season when it drops. I would absolutely just sit there for 8 hours or whatever it takes me to do it.
But it's like instinctually you'd love to just binge it, but at the same time, it's the conversation that exists around it that is part of the enjoyment. It makes us more of a 8-week experience rather than I binged it all in one day, told people on the internet it was good or not.
Yeah, you get to digest, you get to process, you get to discuss, you get to theorize and speculate, you get to talk with fellow fans about what they like, what they don't like, and where they think it's going to, I love that aspect. I love getting to talk Star Wars, not just watch a big chunk of it and then go regurgitate it to somebody else. I want to talk about it.
We also know that the 4th season is already in motion. Favreau said he's already written it. We should expect characters from Skeleton Crew to pop up in that.
Interesting. Confirming crossover.
Yeah.
I mean, we know there's going to be crossover, but to say that the characters are going to go back and forth is really interesting.
Doug Chiang is already working on drawing concept art for the scripts. In his interview, he confirmed that not only is the 4th season not going to be the last, but he hopes that this story continues for a long time. In fact, he's got no end in sight.
I'm sure Disney doesn't either. I mean, it's their flagship, carry the network or streaming service show right now, let's be honest about it.
He said, no, I don't think I have an ending in mind. I think the beauty of it is it's a middle chapter of a much larger story. And though we'll have a resolution over time with these characters, I think that how these characters fit into the larger scope and scale. But it's not like there's a finale that we're building to that I have in mind. Quite the contrary, I love for these stories to go on and on. And so these characters potentially could be with us for a while. I really love telling stories in their voice, and I love the way the adventures unfold, and I'm looking forward to doing much more.
I'm curious what he means calling it the middle chapter. What is he considering the first chapter and the end chapter in that statement? Like the first couple seasons, and then there's going to be a later seasons, or does he mean in the bigger picture?
Maybe this is the beginning of like phase 2. Because we're starting to get away from just here's the small story of the bounty hunter and his foundling. We're moving into phase 2 where I think the characters within the Mandoverse are branching into a new threat, into a new universe.
Well, I guess what I'm asking, does he mean he's implying moving to the sequel trilogy that, the beginning is the originals and the prequels, now we're going to bridge the gap between that and the sequels? Is that what he's implying? He's just talking about the Mandoverse in itself, that now we're kind of in a middle phase of it and it's going to expand even further in on itself, if that makes sense?
I like to think he's talking about just his shows here. Like, I think we know he takes a lot of inspiration from the MCU. And think about it, the beginning phase of the MCU was the standalone movies. All these characters getting introduced, established who they are, what they're about, what their personal goals are. And then they moved into stuff like Avengers, where we have to work as a team. We've got an actual enemy. We've got bigger goals rather than just ourselves. So I think that he's kind of feels to me like he's referring to things in that sense.
Yeah, I think he is. I'm curious because it is interesting for him to say it's the middle chapter. Like, well, middle chapter of what book exactly? The book you were creating or the larger book of Star Wars? But no, I'm happy to hear no end in sight. I'm loving the Mandoverse right now. I mean, by and large, it's,
We'll see
there's always good
how
and
it
bad.
goes at the end of
Everything.
this season, how Ahsoka's going to treat us, how Skeleton Crew's going to treat us, because they are a part of the Mandoverse.
Yeah, I'm super excited, obviously, for Mando Season 3. Got high, high hopes for Ahsoka series. Skeleton Crew, we'll see. I mean, I definitely hope it's great. It sounds like it could be fun and interesting, and it's curious to hear it's going to, cross over directly into The Mandalorian.
Well, we do have 2 spin-offs coming for Mandalorian later this year, according to Disney Plus, with Ahsoka and Skeleton Crew. Favreau said that the intention of the teams behind all of the series is for them to be able to stand on their own, but also feed off each other, similarly to what the MCU has been doing for 15 years. He said, so they're not completely standalone, they do have a continuity to them, and we definitely do discuss and talk about how we flip these cards over and what's available to us as storytellers from season to season. Even though we're still refining and working on Ahsoka and Skeleton Crew in post-production, I wrote season 4. I have to have an understanding of where those cuts are going to get to and what they're going to be like.
It's curious no mention of the crossover series.
Well,
That has not been talked about since Kathleen Kennedy announced it in December of 2020.
yeah, but unless Favreau and Filoni announce it, I don't believe it.
Well, it's not that I don't believe it was an idea. I do wonder if it's still happening. Because you would think this would be the perfect time to mention that eventually we want to converge all these stories into one super story. Or is that the end chapter he's talking about?
It could very well be, maybe.
I just think when Kennedy announced it, you kind of got the impression it would be sooner rather than later. Which makes you wonder, again, Rangers of the New Republic got axed. Did that have like a lot to do with what they were going to do with the crossover? Now they're kind of recovering and postponing crossover or canceling crossover and just thinking to themselves, you know what? We don't need to do the quote unquote Avengers or Defenders thing. Let's just tell these stories. And maybe down the road, if we need a crossover series, we'll do it. Or if it makes sense.
I mean, he also said that Skeleton Crew will feel unique within the Star Wars franchise, but will not deviate enough from what we know and love. He says, yeah, it's unique in a way, but it feels very consistent. At the end of the day, these people all love Star Wars. And the primary goal is to make sure that we stay consistent within what people have come to expect. We stretch it here and there. We try not to repeat ourselves, but in the way props are built, sets are designed, costumes are designed, and to show it on the backdrop of what it's like for young people living in this world is very different from what we've seen from, let's say, Luke Skywalker's childhood and such. So there's a lot of uniqueness to it, but it's thoroughly delightful and enjoyable. It's still in process, but I've seen enough to say that I think people are going to really, really connect with what they're doing.
As if he was going to say again, I think people are going to hate it. But no, I mean, it sounds
connect
good.
With it.
I know. I'm just saying it's what they're always going to say. They're never going to bash their upcoming projects. But I'm not, which isn't to say they're lying and he thinks it's crap, but
Well,
it's the standard answer. It's a good answer.
Curious as to, because we know when you make a show, sometimes you design things around for the audience you intend. Could this be like more of a young adult Star Wars content show?
Didn't they say the idea was to make it for adults but involve children, more or less? Like a younger... I mean, I'm assuming it's going to try to appeal to both, right? Most Star Wars does aim for both crowds. Maybe not Andor so much. Andor's probably the one exception that's really
it's
for
an
older
crowd.
Yes. I'm not saying kids can't watch it and like some aspects of it, but it's more adult oriented, I would say. No, but overall, good stuff. I like what he has to say. I usually do. I usually like to hear what Favreau and Filoni are talking about and what they got planned, and hearing that there's no end in sight with Mando, which I'm all for. I'm not in that position yet where I'm like, oh, can we just move on from this? No, I feel like it's just heating up. And for better or worse, because I did like the smaller first 2 seasons, especially that first season. I thought it was really well done just to get this more intimate and personal story in Star Wars. And now we're expanding, and I think it's going to work. All right, well, that is all we got for you this time. So now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell us what you think of any and all of today's news. And again, tell us what you think about Grogu. Can you actually see him being a Mandalorian, doing Mandalorian things, or do you see him kind of becoming a Jedi, a merge of the two? What do you see the future being like for this character? Whatever the case may be, leave those comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.